What's up, YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and I am back with another type of video. If you enjoy these type of videos, make sure you leave a thumbs up and also leave a comment in the comment section below if you feel like I need to talk about something else or anything that is a part of NBA history. Now, I was going back through my NBA history and just refreshing myself, and I got to the point where I felt comfortable with at least my knowledge through the 80s, so I decided to go further into the 70s. And it was a lot of players that, quite frankly, I've just never heard of in my life. And it was kind of weird because I felt like I knew enough about basketball to know that if a player played in the 70s, their careers should have transitioned at some point to the 80s. And through my research, I started to find a consistent theme that was pretty disturbing. Before we get into the big secret, the big problem with the NBA in the late 70s and mid 80s, let me just paint the picture for you real quick. See, in the 70s, the NBA struggled quite consistently with relevancy, at least with their fans, in trying to grow bigger. The transition from the 60s to the 70s seemed like it should be somewhat easy. The grit and grind, blue-collar big men of Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell, that transition from the 60s to the 70s with certain players such as Dave Cowens and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar seems like something that a lot of NBA fans were going to be up for and ready to be able to at least participate in when it comes to the fandom when watching NBA games. However, it seemed like there was some consistent struggle, at least when it came to the mid 70s to the late 70s. The lack of televised games through the late 70s was quite an embarrassment when it came to the NBA, especially when it hit rock bottom in the late 70s, where you had two consecutive NBA finals that weren't even televised live, they were on tape delay. And the biggest struggle with the NBA in the 70s is the obvious competition between the NBA and the ABA. The two leagues throughout the entire decade went back and forth when it came to rating and revenues. Behind the scenes, the ABA was slowly but surely declining, especially when it came to revenue. However, they had some input and some interesting features that they had in their league that the NBA, quite frankly, didn't have. And even though eventually they would merge together, the amount of money that had to be put forth to make sure that happened almost collapsed the NBA entirely. Not only that, some of the NBA fans, if not majority of them, quite frankly did not like the way that the ABA was played. Unfortunately for them, the NBA moved forward with their decision. However, there is something that a lot of people overlook what happened in the late 70s to the mid 80s, and that was the drug problem. Now, when I say drugs, I don't mean, steroids or anything like that. When I'm talking about drugs, I'm talking about cocaine. I'm talking about very hard addictive drugs, heroin, even weed to a degree. In the late 70s to mid 80s, cocaine addiction along with heroin not only claimed some NBA players, but also consistently claimed people in urban communities. In urban communities, you had multiple people struggling to understand the financial burden that they consistently put themselves in, so their escape from reality was used through drugs. Unfortunately though, that just doesn't make any sense for a multi-millionaire that's in the NBA. However, it was quite prevalent in the NBA locker room in the mid to late 70s and all the way to the mid 80s. The one name that pops into my head from the beginning of the 70s is Spencer Haywood. Spencer Haywood was a fantastic player. He is a Hall of Famer now, a 5-time All-Star, a league champion, and a Rookie of the Year along with MVP. He had multiple seasons in the NBA where he was averaging 20 plus points, almost 31 season, along with 10 or more rebounds. And even in his 1 year in the ABA, he averaged 30 points and 20 boards along with 2 assists. Spencer Haywood was a phenomenal athlete, spent majority of his better years with the Seattle Supersonics and eventually made the transition to the New York Knicks, but unfortunately everything crumbled down when he was with the Los Angeles Lakers. Spencer Haywood's addiction off the court consumed his life so much that his play was being altered while he was on the basketball court. Spencer Haywood had multiple practices and NBA appearances where he just wasn't up to par to what he potentially could have been, even though he was only 30 years of age. And finally, the Los Angeles Lakers decided to call it quits after he fell asleep multiple times in the 1980 season during practices, which is a shame because, like I said before, he was 30 years old. Eventually, he would come back to the NBA and play for the Washington Bullets. However, he just wasn't the same player. multiple games missed, him being cut off the team, him being traded a few times as well towards the end of his tenure in the NBA was a consistent theme, not only with Spencer Haywood, but also with other players in the league. See, unfortunately, back in the 70s and early 80s, there was no strict, concrete drug policy until David Stern took over in the early to mid 80s. NBA teams were just cutting players off, or they would eventually trade them to another team without really disclosing how bad of a drug addict this player may have been. And this was a huge problem, not only because the product on the court obviously was deteriorating, but also you had multiple players who became liability to the league itself. You had players who were drug addicts who were on the basketball court and their heart rate was consistently going up and down because of their play. You match that with the consistent abuse of cocaine off the court, you're literally talking about any player that could just die on the court at any given time. However, Spencer Haywood wasn't the only player in the 70s and 80s that fell victim to this. Slide over to David Thompson, a phenomenal athlete, a player that you probably don't know about, but you probably should. David Thompson at one point was second to the most points scored in an NBA game, obviously behind Wilt Chamberlain. Thompson at one point had a back and forth with George Gervin in his prime, where they were both trying to lead the league in scoring one season. David Thompson went out and put on the show for the last game of the NBA season by having a 73-point performance. David Thompson, again, was a phenomenal athlete, but unfortunately towards the end of the 70s and early 80s, David Thompson had multiple problems with staying on the court and his play staying consistently because of cocaine abuse off the court. Unfortunately, he was in and out of rehab for multiple times when he was in Denver, eventually found himself with the Seattle Supersonics, and his career came to a dramatic conclusion when he had an episode at a nightclub while he was playing with the Seattle Supersonics and he fell down a flight of stairs. I know it's tragic. David Thompson would end his career before he was even 30 years old. Again, an all-time great player who only played 9 years in the NBA because of substance abuse. Moving on to another player named John Drew. Again, another great athlete, two-time All-Star, played for the Atlanta Hawks for the majority of his career. However, beginning his career in the 70s and ended it in the mid-80s, John Drew only played 11 years in the NBA, met his match at the age of 30, and eventually was kicked out of the NBA. And then eventually you have Michael Ray Richardson, who also fell to the same plight of everyone else. See, in the 70s and 80s, like I stated before, there was no concrete rule on what was going on. However, by the early to mid 80s, Larry O'Brien, who was the previous commissioner, was moving out while David Stern was coming in. Now see, when David Stern was a commissioner, he came into power, he understood the problem that a lot of these NBA players were facing along with the team and the league. You had to give these players a chance to rehabilitate themselves, so not only could they have a very successful career, but also as the NBA, you don't want to be held liable for some of these players passing out and having cardiac arrest, which was always a possibility. So because of this, David Stern made a very clear, concrete drug policy. Everybody was going to get 3 strikes. The first strike you was going to get, you immediately had to go to rehab, but you were also going to be on pay. The second strike, again, you went into rehab, however, it wasn't paid leave. And after that point, once your third strike failing the drug test, you were permanently banned from the NBA until otherwise noticed. And this is where we get into the 1986 draft. Because up into the 86 draft, like I stated before, players like Michael Ray Richardson, John Drew, David Thompson, Spencer Haywood consistently found themselves in problems when it came to failing drug tests and being in and out of the NBA. And for the most part, a lot of people assumed that this right here was the right step in the right direction, and it was for sure going to deter some future players from falling victim to cocaine abuse. However, in the 1986 draft, it just hit an all-time high. This draft class alone played a huge role in hiding the problem with the NBA in the mid-80s that consistently plagued a lot of players' careers and eventually their lives, and which is a huge reason why a lot of people don't know about these players. So moving into the 1986 draft, not only did you have Len Bias, but you also had, with the number 3 pick, Chris Washburn, with the number 6 pick, William Bedford, and with the number 7 pick, Roy Tarpley, all players who consistently struggled with substance abuse and it limited their play on the court and in the NBA. So much so that not only did Len Bias pass away, but also the rest of the 3 players found themselves out of the league and potentially even in a jail cell for multiple years at a time. And again, these are just 4 players in the top 10 of the 1986 draft class. It was a massive problem, and it was consistently happening year in and year out, and unfortunately it didn't seem like it was slowing down. Now this is where things get even worse, because this video so far I've only talked about 5 to 8 players, mainly because I don't want to get too much detail about other people's lives, especially if I don't have that much detail on their lives. However, from what I've read, drugs and other activities off the court was running rampant, not just through the late 70s, but all through the 70s. There was a whole bunch of mess that David Stern had to clean up after Larry O'Brien left from being a commissioner. And because of that, David Stern had to make a permanent ban on some of these players to hide the flaws with the NBA, and he consistently had to grow the NBA to where it's at today. And after him, obviously Adam Silver picked up. But if you go back and you look at what Larry O'Brien did in the 70s and early 80s, quite frankly, it was a joke. And fortunately for the NBA and for all of us, David Stern did end up correcting a lot of mistakes that Larry O'Brien had set in place during the 70s. Unfortunately though, it did come with a cost. Because of the lack of forward thinking that Larry O'Brien had in the 70s and early 80s, it did leave all of us as NBA fans coming up with lack of understanding and appreciation of how great some of the players were in the 70s. And also me, Nick Smith, Mike Zemba, Dom 2K, NBA Insider, and everybody else, we don't have any 70s footage whatsoever to show you guys, so we're showing you still images because Larry O'Brien wasn't recording a lot of those games, which again is a shame because I would love to see some of these players that I just got done talking about. I would love to see a lot more highlights of them. However, it's extremely hard to find these players on YouTube or any site whatsoever. So because of that, it is unfortunate, but that is the truth about the NBA and what was going on in the 70s and 80s and how it ended up hindering not only my knowledge, but of everybody else's knowledge of players past 79. So with that being said, I'll see you all later. Peace.